Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode from the Bones Bible Handbook. We are going to look at the book of Ruth. We are making our way through the Old Testament, and we have finally reached a book that is titled after a female. Yay! Ruth! And what a female she was. So let's go ahead and dive into that. But before we do, I got to open up in prayer. Father, I just thank you for Ruth's life. I thank you for what an example it is to us and the things that we can learn, Lord. I just thank you that it was given to us to be able to study and to be able to apply to our own lives. And I just ask that you would bless our time together. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, we are looking at the book of Ruth, and it starts out, our author starts out with scripture from Ruth chapter 1, verse 16, that says, "Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." The theme of the book of Ruth is redemption, and they calculate that the date written was somewhere between 1030 and 1010 BC. The author is relatively unknown. Some think it might be Samuel, but there's no, from what they can tell, no distinct determination of who the author might be. The setting is both Moab and Bethlehem. It starts out in Moab, and eventually they end in Bethlehem. The Book of Ruth takes place during the spiritually dark days of Judges. And last time we were together, we talked about the book of Judges and the 12 judges and the cycle that the Israelites were in, that they found themselves in multiple times. And I would encourage you to go back and listen to the video on the book of Judges to get a better understanding of the cycles that the Israelites found themselves in and that many times we find ourselves in. Ruth is the story of a woman named Ruth who lives during the evil period in Israel's history, but she does not succumb to the moral decay of her time. Her story is one of integrity, righteousness, and faithfulness. Her story covers about 11 to 12 years. She and Esther are the only women who have books of the Bible named after them. Let's look at the skeleton of the book of Ruth. Ruth's story opens up with a severe famine in the land of Israel, including the town of Bethlehem. And this famine forces an Israelite named Elimelech to move with his wife Naomi and his two sons to Moab, which was a country to the east. So while living there, both sons marry Moabite women, but they subsequently die. And so does the father, which leaves the wife and the two daughter-in-laws alone, leaves them by themselves. Now alone, Naomi decides that it's time to return to her homeland, and she suggests that her two daughter-in-laws stay there in Moab. Only one of her daughter-in-laws is not for that idea. She wants to go with Naomi. The other daughter-in-law says, "That's fine, I'll stay." But Ruth, her one daughter-in-law, says, "Where you go, I'm going to go." And as in verse 16 says, "Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Ruth chooses to cling to Naomi, even though Naomi says, "No, stay, stay, stay." Ruth says, no, I'm going, and I'm going to follow the God of Israel. And it's because of her desire to be faithful to Naomi, Ruth gives up her gods, her culture, and her people. Well, chapter 2 looks at Ruth's service. Naomi returns to Bethlehem, Ruth with her. And when Naomi goes back to Bethlehem, she's actually seen as a bitter woman. She has suffered a lot of loss, and she lost her husband and she lost her 2 sons. I think certainly one could understand why she'd be a little upset. And she's thinking that God is her enemy because of those losses. But God has plans that she doesn't know about, which begin to unfold when Ruth volunteers to go into the fields around Bethlehem to pick up the grain that's left behind by the harvesters. Such gleaning was permitted to provide for the poor in the land. In God's plan and providence, Ruth enters the field of a man named Boaz. He's a relative of Naomi's. And Boaz has heard of Ruth's faithfulness toward his relative Naomi, and he gives instructions to his workers to leave some grain behind, thus providing for her and Naomi. So Ruth's kindness, her compassion has gotten back. Word has gotten back about this lady, and they've noticed. Boaz has noticed. Well, in chapter 3, Ruth's proposal, we look at a period of over several months, and through different harvests, Ruth is willing to work in Boaz's field to provide for her and Naomi. I love this lady in that she is willing to work. She's willing to go out there. She's willing to help. She's willing to do what it takes. She came from a foreign land. She came from serving foreign gods and from worshiping foreign gods and being with a people that was away from the Lord. And she comes over here and she embraces the land. She embraces the culture. She embraces their God of Israel. And she works, and she's helping to provide for this lady. And here's the thing that you got to remember about Ruth. She also suffered a loss. So Naomi, her mother-in-law, was not the only one who suffered losses. Ruth also suffered the loss of her husband. And yet she is doing all of this. It goes on to say, the author says, but now it's time for Naomi to repay Ruth's kindness and provide for Ruth's future. And so she kind of devises a plan that will force Boaz to make a more serious decision about Ruth. Ruth is instructed by Naomi to engage in a common ancient Near Eastern custom of asking Boaz to take her for his wife in the place of her dead husband because he's a close relative. And this was something that they did back then. It was called the Levirate marriage principle. And it's found in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 and 6. And all of this takes place at night on the threshing floor during the harvest. And it turns out that Ruth's proposal is accepted by Boaz. And he throws a garment over her. And this symbolic action also appears in Ezekiel 16:8, where Jehovah spreads his garment over Israel. Even though Ruth sleeps at Boaz's feet through the night, there is no hint of improper behavior. Well, chapter 4, and keep in mind, this is a really short book, the book of Ruth. Boaz agrees to marry Ruth as a close relative, but reveals the next morning that he must first ask another man, a closer relative, to see if that man wanted to fulfill the Levirate custom. And in the final chapter, we see that Boaz comes before the local elders and with them as witnesses asks this closer relative about Ruth. And the man declines, thus permitting Boaz to marry Ruth. And God blesses Ruth's devotion by giving her a husband in Boaz and a son, Obed, who would later be the grandfather of the famous future king of Israel, David. Let's put some meat on the bones, shall we? The book of Ruth gives great encouragement. As God provides an example of godly behavior in the midst of widespread ungodliness during the time of the judges. Ruth's faithfulness to follow the God of Israel leads to great blessings, not only for her, but for Naomi, for Boaz, and ultimately for the world as she takes the place in the family line of Jesus Christ. When you think about this, This was a lady who lived in Moab, who followed pagan gods. She wasn't even following the God of Israel. When she was living over in Moab and she met Naomi and her 2 sons and her husband, she wasn't even following the God of Israel. She was following the pagan gods. And here she comes to when her husband dies, and which was Naomi's son, and Naomi's husband and her other son die, and Naomi decides to go back to Bethlehem, and Ruth goes with her. She embraces the God of Israel, and her life is changed. And then she's blessed, and now she is in the lineage of Jesus. And we find that lineage of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, where we talk about the genealogy of Jesus. And it talks about in verse 5, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Now remember, Rahab we talked about a couple of videos ago when we talked about Joshua. And Rahab being the prostitute that hid the 2 spies. Even Rahab is in the lineage of Jesus. She has Boaz. That's Boaz's mother, is Rahab. Okay? And so then Boaz is the father of Obed. Ruth's his mother. And then Obed is the father of Jesse, who's the father of David. And then you take and continue that generational line all the way through until you get to the final end of it. And it says, and Jacob, and I'm just reading from the Bible here, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is Christ. So you see how Ruth and Rahab both are in the lineage of Jesus. Let's see, fleshing it out in your life and mine, because there's always a life application for us from the Bible. I think that's the great thing about it. In addition to seeing Ruth's faithfulness to the God of Israel and to Naomi, we also see Boaz's integrity and his faithfulness in action. Boaz became a kinsman redeemer, or a close relative who, in essence, redeems the Gentile Ruth and gives her a home. And their union produces a son who produces a grandson in David, and whose ultimate ancestor is Jesus Christ. You know, the book of Ruth gives us an important analogy of the work of Christ. Like Boaz, Jesus is related to us by his physical birth. He's able to pay the price of redemption, willing to redeem, and he's able to redeem. And like Ruth, we must choose to accept that redemption and leave the transaction to Jesus, who makes that redemption a reality. Don't be like Ruth's sister-in-law, who chose to return to her pagan gods and was lost forever. Come to Jesus, who's your kinsman redeemer, and live forever. You know, when we think about when Naomi first told those girls, I'm going back to Bethlehem, where I came from. There's nothing for me here now. We came here because there was a famine in Bethlehem, and we came to Moab, and now I've lost my husband and my 2 sons, and I'm going back to Bethlehem where my family is. And Orpah, I think her name was Orpah, had a choice to return to Bethlehem with her, but she chose to stay. And Ruth did choose to go back to Bethlehem with Naomi, and what a difference it made in her life. Well, there's life lessons for us from the book of Ruth. Albeit 4 chapters long, the book of Ruth offers some life lessons for us. Here's the first one. When you think, what you think to be a tragedy is God's opportunity to show himself faithful. The next one is your abundance is an opportunity to help the less fortunate. You know, and that ties back to Boaz. When Ruth was in the fields trying to gather up the leftovers, Boaz left the leftovers there for her on purpose so that she could take them home and take care of Ruth. He could have very easily instructed his harvesters to pick those up and bring them home too. Take it all, bring it all. Don't leave anything. But he didn't. He left it there so that the poor people could have some. And Naomi and Ruth were able to have that leftover grain. You know, another life lesson for us is that God honors faithfulness. And I think, you know, the thing that comes to my mind about that is that even in the tough times that we experience, and a lot of us experience difficult things every day, remaining faithful through those, instead of turning and cursing God, instead of telling God, I don't need you anymore, instead of telling God, you're never there for me, remaining faithful through those difficult times, God honors that. We're going to have hard times. Jesus told us, take heart. Life is not going to be easy. But don't give up, because in the end, I win. Don't give up. Life's going to be hard, but don't give up. Remain faithful, because God is faithful. You know, another life lesson for us is character is a noble quality that God honors. You know, adverse circumstances give us an opportunity to exhibit godly character. An easy adverse circumstance, although it wouldn't be to the degree of adverse that a lot of people know, but we're riding in the car and somebody cuts us off, or somebody backs into us, and we want to shout and scream and yell all kinds of things at them to get back at them, and we want to give them the one finger salute, and we want to curse them and say all these things that are inappropriate because that anger filled up in us, and then we just explode over their what sometimes we would call stupidity or bad decisions, you know. Those are times when we have an opportunity to show godly character instead, and to not, as I say, lose our witness. You know, people tease me sometimes because I have a cross hanging from my rear view mirror, and they're like, you probably have that hanging from your rear view mirror so that you don't do anything ungodly or to the drivers around you. It's a great reminder for me, honestly. It's a great reminder for me to remember that when somebody cuts me off and they're flipping me the bird, to not in response respond inappropriately, but just to let that person go and to just be as godly as possible. Not that I'm trying to be all that in a bag of chips, but that I'm trying to exhibit godly character by not returning the favor. In the old days, I returned the favor. I'll just be honest. In the old days, I returned the favor more than once, and that didn't get me anywhere. What was that going to do, right? Nowadays, just to diffuse it, I just turn the other cheek. I'm not going to return the favor. Is it perfect every single time? No. But that cross hanging from my rearview mirror reminds me that one greater than me gave it all for me. And that's my focus. That's my purpose in life. That's what I've been called to do, is to share that. Not to share my one finger salute. All right, well, where to find it? Since we only have 4 chapters in the book of Ruth, this would be real easy. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi is in chapter 1. Boaz's kindness to Ruth, chapter 2. God's provision of a kinsman redeemer, Ruth chapter 3. And if you don't quite understand the kinsman redeemer thing, I would encourage you to look that up, because it was a practice that they did back then in the Old Testament. And then Christ's lineage through Ruth is in chapter 4. Let's look at Boaz real quick. He is a portrait of a godly man, and some ways that we can describe him are diligent. He was friendly, he was merciful, he was godly, he was encouraging, he was generous, he was kind, he was discreet, and he was faithful. Those are some pretty awesome qualities for Boaz. Pretty awesome qualities for a godly man. Well, that is it on the book of Ruth. Being that there's 4 chapters, the synopses are a little shorter. And again, I would urge you, if you missed any of the previous videos, especially Judges that we recorded previously, or Joshua, any of those on Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, to go back and watch those to get an idea of what those books are about. The more we can understand about the Bible, I think the better off we are, in that it can help us. I think oftentimes, and I've said this before, if we don't understand the Bible, then we tend not to pick it up and read it. Then we tend not to draw wisdom from it. Then we tend not to apply the principles to our lives. We just say, well, I know better. As we talked about in Judges, remember where Judges was, everyone did right in what they thought was right in their own eyes. And I think sometimes we can do that, and it's not always the right thing. So thanks for joining me, and I pray that you have a blessed day, evening, or whatever time you're watching that. Hi, everybody that has joined me. If you've missed part of this recording, please go back and watch it from the beginning. I would love that. I hope it's been an encouragement to you. And for those of you just joining me for the first time tonight, we are in this book here, Bones Bible Handbook by Jim George. Just a great book here that gives us a synopsis of each book of the Bible. So you can imagine, I'm only on, I think, book 6 or 7, and there's 66. So I'm going to be around for a while, God willing, and the creek don't rise. Y'all take care now. Bye.